show. I'm your host, Dennis Asserson. Today's guests are Carl Duivenvoorden and Peter Corbyn, both of whom were trained with Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth back in 2006. It's 12 years now, and it's definitely time for a catch-up and an update and where we need to go in the near future. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thanks, guys. There's so many directions to go at the beginning. So my instinct is to ask, what's top of mind for each of you? Like short answer, like what's so present for you today that it's like, oh, people need to know this?
I'll let Carl go first.
For me, I think, Dennis, it's transitioning as quickly as we can to renewable energy, taking advantage of that green economy, getting the jobs and opportunities that come with it, and thereby sending a whole lot less money out of the province on imported fossil fuels and doing a really good thing for the environment, because we're achieving that one key thing, which is getting off of fossil fuels and getting our emissions down to zero.
Peter?
My answer is one word: urgency. We still haven't, I don't believe, made this an urgent enough issue yet. Simple as that.
Any thoughts as to why? Because there was a recent report that came out, IPCC. Can you fill me in on what that acronym means?
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it's a leading group of scientific experts who actually work and publish in the field of climate change. They're from countries all over the world, and it is under the umbrella of the United Nations.
And just 2 weeks ago, they were pushing a major panic button.
Yes.
Which would tie to what you said, and you had a part solution is getting off fossil fuels. What was stunning was how little media covered it in terms of, if there's one issue globally that everyone should be focusing on, it's this. But it was a 30-second or a 1-minute news clip in a series of news stories that ran 2 days, and that was it.
I think the issue there, quite frankly, Dennis, is the media, right? We jump on the latest, CNN and Donald Trump, right? Like, what is the issue of today in breaking news every hour, right? The media, most of the media, unlike yourself, for example, they will jump over the story like that and milk it and then move on to the next story. The trouble with climate change is that it's something that doesn't have an immediate thing to it, right? So the IPCC report comes out and it hits the news cycle in the traditional media for, a couple of stories and then goes away. Meanwhile, we're watching, who knows what we'll be watching tonight about Donald Trump, right? So that to me is an issue, because it's a long, those of us in the field have been committed to doing this for decades. We have a sense of immediacy, but you don't wake up tomorrow morning and be rid of fossil fuels, right? And that's one of the challenges with the media, is the media feeds off what happened then and now.
Yeah, it seems we live in a world of soundbite media, because we've gotten our attention spans so short, 140 characters or something like that, Our attention spans are so short that we quickly move on. And we live in this world of sound bites, and all kinds of irrelevant things catch our attention. They're catchy. And in the business of the media, I suppose they sell ads, they sell papers, they sell clicks, they generate views. And unfortunately, when you look at climate change, it's the long emergency. In fact, I think there was a book out that called it that way. It's the long emergency. If we have a fire, everybody knows what to do. Call 911, and it makes the news. Yeah. But then you have a slow emergency like climate change. And it's funny, even though we are the species, the only species that has an appreciation of time in terms of a past and a future, we seem to have such a hard time getting our heads around the notion that, this is coming in the future. And it may take a little bit longer. It may have it may not be as immediate as that fire that gets all the attention, but it's much, much more serious. So somehow we have to rise above that. That's I think, an Achilles heel in human nature, that we just seem to be able to ignore what's unpleasant to us and just put it aside and wait till the 11th hour. Well, look, we're well past the 11th hour on climate change.
We're past that.
We need to act, but we also need to make it real to everyone, so that everyone owns it as well.
Which ties a little bit to helping nurture a better public perception. And JOQ Public in general terms, and for you guys it's 12 years if not longer, the difference between climate and weather. So when you talk about the fire, people will go, "Oh yeah, I saw that photo on social media of the iceberg when it all collapsed, or the ice shelf that all collapsed." And so they'll capture that moment, or they'll say, "Oh, you know, it snowed today and it's July." They'll do those frozen windows of time, pun intended, but they won't catch that it's part of a longer pattern or another pattern. And that's always struck me as fascinating, because it is part of another pattern, and these are moments that should be reinforcing this larger view, and they don't. It stays frozen as an anomaly. Or
But the risk of those anomalies is going up, happening faster and more frequently. Carl is, I don't know what you're at number-wise, but this gentleman just boggles my mind sometimes. But when we did these presentations back in 2007, I kind of joked with the climate project in the States that I adopted a stalker. And 3 presentations I did in St. John, I had someone, and you probably, I won't say who the gentleman's name is, but we adopted the stalker who would come out and say, "You're crazy, and Al Gore is full of it," and blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
And the first 2 presentations I did with him there, I had no idea who he was or what he was doing. The third time he was there, I was given a heads up. So there was probably about 100 people in the audience, and he was starting to interrupt me, and the people in the audience, suggested that he wait until he's done. Wait till I'm done so we could have a conversation about it as opposed to being interrupted.
Yeah.
So when I was finished, I knew what he was going to throw at me, and when I was done, I had the slides on my slide deck waiting for him, but didn't share them with anyone. So when I was done, I said, "Okay, bring it on. Come on."
Yeah.
And one of his points, to your point, was exactly with weather. Okay, so the weatherman can't predict whether or not it's going to rain or snow tomorrow. So my analogy to that is like Wayne Gretzky or Sidney Crosby's or Roger Clemens' career. You knew that Wayne Gretzky, over the period of a career, after a couple of years in early in his career, when he was getting 200 points a season, you knew he'd peak there for a while, but over time, as he got older, his performance would go down, right? It happens with every single athlete, even if you're Wayne Gretzky. Yep. So the point being, in the early 80s, you knew that Gretzky was good for about 200 points in a given season, okay? Now, you did not know in any given shift whether he would get a point or not. So he averaged 2.5 points per game, right? Which meant that if you went to an Oilers game in 1983, odds are you might see Gretzky get a couple of points, right? You might see him get 0, or you might see him get 6, but over the course of the season, he'd be good for 200 points. The point of that analogy is a shift or a game in which Wayne Gretzky played in is equivalent to the weather in a given day. The climate is equivalent to his career. So you knew that if Gretzky was to play 20 seasons and he got 2,800 points, you could see the curve of his career and output. But on any given night, you would have no clue. So you could trace the career. Like we look at Sidney Crosby now, he's probably got 5, 6, 7 seasons left. He'll be good for another 400 or 500 points in his career. We can predict that more or less, but we can't predict if he's going to get 3 goals tomorrow night or 4 assists. So that's, to me, the sports analogy between weather and climate. So anyway, I shared that with him. I never heard from him again.
Yeah.
Like
Because you guys work in the nuts and bolts, so I imagine there's a certain level of frustration. You might be going, "Do I have to do this again in order to get people to see the
Never.
Well, I mean, it does. It's true to some extent. I find myself getting a little bit more tired of having to repeat the same things that we've known for a long time in terms of explaining something. Yet, on the other hand, every person who becomes enlightened or learns more and all of a sudden realizes this really is happening, look, that's a victory. That's a small victory, and enough small victories win the larger battle, which we must win. Yes. Right? And for me, my own take on that weather one is to take one isolated weather event is a little bit like assuming that you take one pixel on a television screen and you see the whole picture. Right?
Ooh,
and one
I like
pixel, one pixel can be any color at any time and gives you absolutely no indication of the entire picture. So you have to step back and you have to look at the big picture, realizing that all the pixels are changing all the time. But generally speaking, there's a big picture.
Mhm.
You know, and weather is a very small snippet of a much larger picture. You know, we can perseverate on the little micro things here or there. Now, climate change is the big deal. Step back from our little corner in the
Yeah.
world and look at the whole world and the whole trend.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. It'll feed into a shift I'd like us to go now with the conversation. Thanks for touching on that difference between weather and climate. Because for the audience watching at home, please share the show because that can clarify for more people the distinction between weather and climate change. So back to where does action come from? Because tied to what you just laid as a foundation, there's this human element to where we're stuck. And for me, some of that's because we don't trust. We gotta learn to trust science. We need to learn to trust where the changes will come from. I'll try to weave an emotional element into the interview while we go through some specifics, which is gonna be fun when we get into the weeds, which will be your slideshow stuff and some specifics for Atlantic Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But always weave in the back, if you can, this theme of trust. Like, will people trust this information? That'll get us over the hump about politics. And here's the setting I wanted to put up. It's a story from mid-October 2018. Mayor of Montreal, we need to act now on climate change. So we have a mayor of a large city saying something like that. You've got Nobel Prize winning economist says carbon taxes are the solution to climate change. So that gets into a specific, but he goes, the quote is, "The problem is not knowing what to do," says Paul Romer. "The problem is getting consensus to act," which goes back to trust. Now here's a headline from New Brunswick the past week with our minority government situation and that flux. The headline reads, "Agree to disagree, Glant and Higgs won't work together to form a coalition government." So you've got a mayor of a large metropolitan area saying, we need to act now. You've got a Nobel Prize winning scientist says, we know what to do, but we don't know how to build consensus. And you've got a small province saying they're two political entities saying, but we're not gonna work together. That's the milieu that we're in with trying to get consensus on climate change. Now, is there something specific that you two feel New Brunswickers need to know about how it's going to impact our province? And maybe that's enough to shift policies on farming and fishing and forestry and infrastructure and water management. And so take us into something specific about how climate change is going to impact New Brunswick. Yeah, but isn't that where we are?
How long do we have?
But that's where we are. People need to hear and know and trust this.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting you mentioned about the emotional side of things because I tend to be a person deeply engaged in science. For me, it's all about facts and evidence, but I also know there's that strong other side, and there's room for everybody in this tent, and there are compelling reasons that can be shown, I think, to people of who with whom science resonates, or with whom art resonates, or with whom anything else resonates in terms of the impacts of climate change. Just over the weekend, I was again looking at a piece that was done by Margaret Atwood, and her quote, "This isn't climate change, it's everything change." And she writes very, very clearly about a lot of impacts of climate change, and it's pretty compelling stuff. Now, just to bring it back to New Brunswick, well, lots of issues in New Brunswick. Our big industries are resource-based industries. They depend on good weather for the most part. They depend on soil, water, temperature, these types of things. And we're going to see a lot of changes to those. My background is agriculture. I was raised on a farm. I went to agricultural college. So I'm pretty keen on what happens within agriculture. And we see there's some very good models out there now looking forward towards 2050, 2080 in terms of what will happen under different emission scenarios, whether we continue with business as usual, which is the worst case scenario of emissions, whether we manage to stem our emissions somewhat, or whether we can take a drastic cut and reduce them globally, of course. What are the impacts on New Brunswick? And we see that, for example, over the timeline of 2050, 2080, we're seeing significant temperature increases, 2 to 5 degrees, I think. We're seeing significant increases in the number of days over 30 degrees Celsius. Now, 30 degrees Celsius is a pretty hot day. And I think in the most extreme models going forward, some parts of New Brunswick will have potentially about 60 days over 30 degrees each year by 2080. That's pretty serious stuff.
Mhm.
Temperature. That's one. But there's another big one that I think is a sleeper, and I think a lot of people don't know enough about this one. Because when I present that in front of audiences, you kind of see that you're getting people's attention, and that is sea level rise. We're a province that's surrounded on 3 sides by salt water. And I think most people don't have an appreciation of just how much water is locked up in land-based ice up in the mountains, or to a larger extent in Greenland, which is the combined size of Labrador and Quebec.
Mhm.
And it's got at its deepest 3 kilometers of ice. 3 kilometers of ice. Or Antarctica, which is 1.5 times the size of Canada, and it averages 2 kilometers of ice. So you put that all together, and there's enough water locked up in ice that's sitting above sea level that if it were to all melt, it would raise sea levels worldwide a couple of hundred feet. A couple of 100 feet. Now, that's not going to happen fast. That's thousands of years out, except climate change is a bit like a train, I figure. Because it seems to me it takes an awful lot to get it moving. But once it's moving, it takes an awful lot to slow it down. And we're starting to see some distressing signs of melting happening in Greenland in particular, and in the western Antarctic. And they've got the potential, even just those 2 chunks of what I've mentioned, have the potential to raise sea levels worldwide several meters. Now you look around New Brunswick, and I think every one of our cities except Edmundston would be affected by rising sea level, and a lot of our towns. So it seems to me that this is a huge risk that we know exists, but most people do not realize. And let me just put a quick point to it with this. I think it was 4 years ago, a study was done for our provincial government with regards to specifically the issue of sea level rise. And maps came out of that, projecting forward what sea level, what storm surges will be doing. And there are zones all the way around New Brunswick, from the Bay of Chaleur along the Gulf of St. Lawrence and all the way through to the Bay of Fundy. And you can go and look, and you can see that in the case of, for example, one section, I haven't looked at them all, but I randomly pulled up one, and it was the area around St. John. And what is a once-in-a-100-year event around now, or in fact it goes back to 2010. What was a once-in-a-100-year event by 2030 I think is a once-in-a-25-year event. And by the time we're at 2100, it's an annual event. A storm surge, let me say that again, a storm surge that is 1 in 100 years now, by the year 2100, will be an annual event. Big risk for infrastructure. Big risk for a whole bunch of things. Sea level rise is a huge issue for us here.
I agree.
When you two took your training in 2006, I can remember watching Inconvenient Truth umpteen times, and thinking, and you two went through that like hands-on, which is pretty fascinating. And some of those slides that Mr. Gore included in the show back then about infrastructure needs and changes. And of course he used Florida and New York and parts of California because high population centers for the displacement based on water movement. The equivalent in New Brunswick, we don't have a place to tell that story, that how many people are going to have to move and how many roads are going to be underwater. But can we connect some of the recent weather events we've seen, because they've been framed in a similar way? Oh, we haven't seen the flood of 2018 in like 100 years. Can you play in that space, or is there enough happening in real world time to get people to go, it's now?
I will give you 3 examples of that very, very now. One is, I live out in Hanwell, so we're probably 200 feet above sea level maybe. And on the surface you think, I live in Hanwell, if downtown Fredericton floods, I'm okay from a selfish perspective, right? I really don't want to see downtown Fredericton flood, but I'm thinking I'm okay. Well, where I live in Hanwell, we've got a creek that runs by our house, between us, our neighbors and us. So we've got a culvert. We've got the creek beside our house. Our street is L-shaped. We've got a culvert that runs under the street, and then it goes under another culvert to get out to a lake. So twice last summer, or this summer, actually twice this year. Sorry, there's one in the spring and another one later in the year with a heavy rainfall. The second culvert backed up and flooded one of our neighbors' backyard. And this was just a heavy rainfall in Hanwell. right? So I went down there twice to take a look at it. I took some video and saved it for whoever would be around, and I managed to catch some engineers there twice working on it. And they were telling me that they're just doing the engineering now. They've been contracted by the provincial government to take a look at this. And I talked to the engineers. And I said, well, we're going to have to put in a larger culvert, et cetera, et cetera. I said, okay, great, thank you very much. And I thought, we might see that in 2 or 3 years from now, maybe 4 years from now. It got replaced last week. Not only did they replace one culvert, they put 2 culverts in there. One for overflow, because one for the fish. So the regulations have changed for life to go through, which apparently I didn't know there were fish there until they told me, which is good to know. But they put a second overflow in. So what was one culvert is now 2. And that project in one culvert, probably, I'm going to say 50 or 60 feet long, in one street in Hamwell, New Brunswick, took about 2 weeks to replace. They had to dig a big hole. Now, if you extrapolate that to probably thousands of other places in New Brunswick, that is a large capital cost for the taxpayer from a mitigation perspective. So properties in Hanwell and numerous other communities in the province don't flood, because if that does flood and my basement's flooded, guess who you're calling, right? So that's one real world one that happened this summer. Yeah. Not expecting that to be replaced. The other one is just these weather events, and like Carl said, with the expectation of 60 days, 30 degrees plus. I'm sure all 3 of us can remember living here 15 years ago in Fredericton and never needing an air conditioner. Yeah. Right? Down in St. Andrews this summer, where my mother lives, there were a number of days in St. Andrews this summer where they said, geez, we need air conditioning. They didn't need air conditioning in St. Andrews 10 years ago. Right? So that's another example. But the other one I think that's truly scary from a real time is storm surges. So not only with the rising sea level increase, as the frequency of these storm surges increases, one of the things that scares me is the reporter saying, well, we're lucky it was low tide. Yes. Right? Well, if it's the right time of the month with the moon and it's high tide, that storm surge could have been, Water Street was taken out. 3 streets up were taken out as well. And these are real. I mean, that's like playing Russian roulette or with the tides when a storm surge comes.
Would that also slide into the upper end of the Bay of Fundy for Moncton, and slide into Nova Scotia and the Isthmus?
100%. 100%. Like Carl said earlier, that to put it in other terms, the risk of Nova Scotia becoming an island was a 1 in 100 year event, which is now down to 1 in 10, which is going to become more frequent. So that drive from Sackville to Amherst, the frequency of that not getting through there, not only from an economic perspective for Nova Scotia, but also just the potential costs of addressing that from infrastructure perspective, that's a lot of zeros.
Yeah, we've seen some pretty frightening storm surges around the province. We've seen them in Port Elgin, we've seen them along the Northumberland Strait, Shediac area. We've seen them up on the Bay of Chaleur, and of course down in the Bay of Fundy in St. Andrews. They've had some pretty scary storm surges where the entire wharf is it's the water's come just about to the top of the wharf that is normally high and dry. And again, it's a convergence of certain conditions, but it's exactly as you say. We're going to hope that all these events come at low tide and we'll be fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And in the winter, with the more moisture being in the air, are we seeing a difference in the amount of snowfall that comes down and the intensity of the snowfall? Are winters getting a little more harsh, a little more intense because there's more moisture in the air? And did that tie to the spring flood this year?
I am not sure on that one, Dennis. I think precipitation is one of the tougher pieces of all of this climate modeling. Okay. I know I've read in Department of Environment information, they say going forward we will have a lesser snowpack. On the other hand, this year we had a pretty big snowpack, and that contributed, that was one of the elements in the equation that led to what happened here along the St. John River. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure going forward. However, if we get temperature anomalies in our wrong time of year, that can have a huge impact.
Mm-hmm.
And let's go back to
Well, January had a lot more rain last year than it normally does.
and maybe I'll pick out the most striking example, to me at least, in this province over the past decade or so, and that's Perth Andover. Back in 2012, we had this stretch in March where it was crazy warm. And I mean, we're loving the temperature because we're going through this winter, except it was crazy warm in March. And not only were the records falling, the high temperature records falling in the Upper River Valley, they were being beaten by new records with by a margin of, in some cases, 10 degrees. So usually when records are broken, it's a fraction of a degree or maybe a degree. And in 2012, in March, in that 1 week, I guess we just had a nice hot weather system that was parked right over that region. So several days, records fell, crazy record temperatures, and then Perth Andover got the biggest flood ever. Now, I think in many cases we're reluctant to relate specific events to climate change. You know, even our flood that happened this year, I wouldn't say, well, that's climate change, although it's consistent with what we would see with climate change. I am not that timid about linking the flood in Perth Andover to climate change, because here we got crazy weather for an extended period that was totally an outlier to what we would normally expect, and then boom, that town had a record flood. And in fact, I think that they've had, recently I was reading about it, and I think they've had their 4 worst floods ever within about the last 10 or 15 years.
I make the analogy to smoking. You know, I don't smoke, never have. If I see someone smoking, I want to slap them, to be honest. But, you know, statistically, I may smoke my whole life and never get cancer. But I know if I did smoke, the risk of me getting lung cancer goes up. And we're doing the same thing with humanity, right? It's a risk thing, right? It's like speeding. It's like saying, well, geez, I went drinking and driving. I might not get pulled over, but man, if you do, it's bad news, right? It's a risk thing, and we're literally playing Russian roulette with humanity by letting this drag on much longer than it should.
To take a slight shift in the direction, thanks for laying that out, because I'm hoping these puzzle pieces for the audience and for me start to develop a picture by the time we're done, so that people go, oh, I saw this show with these 2 guys and it finally made sense. Because you've given examples of broad perspective and then individual actions. And we have to dance that dance between, you know, individual Gretzky statistics, or smoking, or Perth Andover got smacked with this one thing, but it tied to this bigger picture. So that when people watch their social media feeds, or they watch the news and it's about banning plastic bags or banning plastic straws or electric cars or whatever the latest commercialism and marketing is going to do to try to exploit, you know, fight climate change or be socially motivated to sign a petition, or all that energy is okay, but it seems to defray rather than create focused change because of the dysfunction within politics, like we pointed out quickly, or that there isn't large-scale collective mass consciousness about where the change needs to occur first. So I wanted to pull this quote from a Gwyn Dyer piece that was in October 10th in Post Media News. And it says, so all the countries that want to stop warming before it goes runaway, except the United States, said governments should aspire to stop the warming earlier at plus minus 1.5 degrees centigrade. And they asked the IPCC to figure out how hard that would be. And the rest of it is, the answer is revealed at a meeting in South Korea on Sunday. It's very hard. There is very little time left. In order to skid to a halt, brakes on hard before we hit minus 1.5 centigrade. We will have to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by almost half, 45%, during the next 12 years. To cut emissions that fast, by 2030, we would have to decide to close down all remaining coal-fired power plants. That's worldwide. It would take the next decade to get that done and get the same energy from expanded renewable resources, water, wind, solar, leaving us just on track to reach zero emissions by 2050. So the notion of shutting down all the coal-fired power plants in the next 2 years, and how unfeasible it is, And yet that's the scale it's now being measured at. In order to stop hitting that, we've gotten 2 degrees warmer instead of 1.5 degrees warmer. What can we do here different from plastic straws and plastic bags? Does it get at big oil? Does it get at big shifts for society to get at what they need to do and find that consensus?
Maybe.
I appreciate it's a big one.
Yeah.
But we got to walk into the big ones because we framed the question.
Yep.
Now we got to dig at it.
A couple of thoughts on that. First one, something people are really familiar with, the 3 R's. Reduce, reuse, recycle. And often when I do talks at schools, I'll ask, so which one of the 3 R's is most important? And I often hear a chorus of recycle.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, once you get into the weeds on all of this, whether it's energy, whether it's food, whether it's, you name it, the most important of the 3 R's, by far, is the first one, reduce. We are incurring a huge eco-debt on this planet. If people say you can't live beyond your means fiscally, makes sense. You can't live beyond your means ecologically either. And we have been living beyond our means ecologically. We're consuming too much. And that's bound to end poorly. So one thing is that we need to start thinking. Reduce in virtually everything that we consume. We just have to start thinking that way. Because, you see, when we start to transition that system that we now rely on fossil fuel-based energy for, if we reduce first, we can transition, first of all, to a smaller system. We don't have to get a megawatt for a megawatt. We can maybe get a half a megawatt for every megawatt of fossil fuel energy we shut down because we're reducing. And the other big one in this is efficiency, right? Because it goes hand in glove with reducing. And that means some pretty basic things like, for example, more insulation in our homes, more fuel efficient vehicles. There are beautiful vehicles out there now that are so much more efficient than the vehicles we typically see on our roads now. That's the low-hanging fruit of getting where we need to go. And if we practice efficiency in every area of our lives that we can, if we strive to reduce in some ways, then all of a sudden, let's get to that third one, which is bringing us to renewable energy, and we'll find out, whoa, that task is a whole lot easier than we thought, because what we're changing to is a smaller requirement of energy. There's a lot more to it than that, and it's a really big picture.
Yeah.
But let me just say, in my own life, I have been striving for the last 10 years to reduce. It stemmed from a quiz I did on the internet a number of years ago. I went to this website called Global Footprint Network, and anyone listening can go and find it right now. Global Footprint Network, and I stumbled on it, and I was intrigued by it because it said to me, Carl, if you put all the elements of your lifestyle in, we will calculate how much land it takes to sustain Carl. So I thought, well, this is very interesting. And I started completing it, and it was simple. It was high-level stuff. What kind of car do you drive? How much do you drive it? What kind of a home do you live in? How big? How many people? Food, and a few other things like this. And I filled it all in, and I hit enter with confidence and maybe a bit of cockiness because I'm the green guy. It's going to tell me how well I'm doing, right? And I was shocked when it came back and told me that if everybody lived like me, we would need 4 planets. 4 planets. There are no 4, right? So it set me on a journey to just strive to incorporate sustainability in all that I do. And I have found that with a bit of commitment and focus on what's real, not what's greenwash, in our family we've been able to make a tremendous difference in our carbon footprint, I think, and we live lovely, comfortable, happy lives. And that's a future to aspire to, I think.
Yeah. Thoughts, Peter?
When I go to the grocery store, I say a landfill in waiting.
40% food waste.
Yeah, when you see people saying, look how much I recycled, like Carl said with the reduce, my thinking is, or thought is, well, if you're recycling that much, that's still a lot of waste you're creating. Packaging, for example, is huge. We carpooled here today, and Carl is Chevy Volt. Yeah, it was a few kilometers, but Carl texted me and said, let's carpool here, right? I said, okay, pick me up. But I agree, we need to make choices in our personal lives and differences that is easier for some than others, but because it's complex, because there are different layers, right? What can we do in our personal life, both from a physical action that we do? How can we influence public policy, for example? That plays a role. And what does that public policy do or act upon? And where does the role of new technologies play a role, and how do they get adopted? So I think, Carlson, I agree, it's very complex, but I think if we simplify each element of what we do and make it easier for us to do a particular action, I think that's a big part of the conversation that doesn't get heard often here, is making it easy. So for example, straws are a good example. Somehow in the last 6 months, everyone said, okay, we're going to get rid of straws, right? Well, and then you see some restaurants now saying, well, we'll give you a straw if you ask for it. Or there's some kind of drinks you just can't eat without a straw, drink without a straw, right? But it's one of those things where you can say a municipality or another jurisdiction can say, well, on January 1st, 2019, no more straws, no more plastic bags. So then with that piece of legislation, the businesses that are in the plastic bag business and the straw business are going to figure out, okay, what's our plan B? We don't have that for climate change as a whole. We can't say, well, right now, although we have the Paris Accord by Kyoto, and I was talking to someone this morning about these being binding, but again, the challenge is realistically, you can say the Paris Accord is binding, but 10 years from now, is the world court or the Hague or whatever, the UN, are they going to take a country to court because they missed their target by 3%? Yep. It ain't going to happen, sadly.
Yep. So we're speaking to the acts an individual can do, or a municipality or a city could do. So banning straws, banning plastic, that kind of thing. But that also invokes the change of a model. I want to expand the scale. So there's the individual action. Every individual action discount becomes part of a bigger behavior, the reduce side of the exercise. But when you were talking, Carl, about reduce, I'm thinking, I remember a news story in 2012 where Target was thinking of moving into Canada. It was a business story. And Target was thinking of taking over the Zellers franchise from Hudson's Bay Company. But they were hesitant to do so because Canada's consumer spending was only 68% of GDP, where in the States it was 72%. Therefore, that 3% would signified a risk for Target to move into Canada. All I took out of that story was 68% of our GDP is based on consumer spending. It's like we've lost any balance in our pieces between manufacturing or services. It's consumer driven. Our economy is consumer driven, which then ties to where we are today, that we need to stop using so much. So there has to be a political economic question attached to your strategy about if we reduce what we do, then there's got to be some lag that's going to hit the economy somewhere. Is that where investing in renewables comes into play? Is that where shifting infrastructure to different places comes into play? When you take something away, you got to put something back to replace it, so human energy has a focus.
It's a very complex, it's a global economy now, right? Very complex, and I think one of the challenges is, we've all heard the term "not in my backyard" or NIMBY, right?
Yeah.
I'm all for, wind power until someone was put in my backyard. I'd be okay with that, but you know what I mean, right?
To interrupt, just a quick sec. There's a great movie called Age is Stupid. Go look for it. It's awesome. It speaks exactly to that.
Yes. So that's that NIMBYism part, but we have this economic NIMBYism as well, right? So we might all get up and say, okay, no more straws, or there's 500 million straws used a day. Well, somewhere there's a factory making straws, right? So if I'm an employee in the straw factory and then employ, say, 500 people, and there's this big movement towards, getting rid of straws, I'm going to be a little nervous. Just like, and rightfully so, if I'm a coal miner in Virginia and I hear get rid of coal, and you see this with Trump now, right?
Well, they won an election in that particular region based on that mindset.
Correct. I don't think it's going to get a re-election, but anyway, be that as it may. But then you've got that straw co, right, and the employees of that business being worried. Now, on the flip side, there could be a company elsewhere that's come out with a a superior straw, like a steel one you carry with you, right?
Yeah.
So that sets up a new company somewhere else on the planet, not making them in the same place as Strawco. Maybe they can make these with 50 people and not 500. So from a complete systems perspective, you're absolutely right. That creates challenges, but in reality, I think what we have to do is look at what we can do in our own backyard, because this is a competitive world, right? And from a local investment perspective, from a local economy perspective, we are New Brunswickers. We should have New Brunswick's back, and we want things to happen here. So if Strawco goes out of business in Kansas or Taiwan, right? You know, maybe those new straws can be made here in New Brunswick, and we've created 50 jobs in Bathurst, for example.
So you're assuming or implying that there's an inherent balance where if something disappears, something else might pop up to fill the space.
100%.
No, fitting with that, an interview 2 years ago with Pat McCarthy on this show, CEO of Recycle New Brunswick. He spoke back then with much enthusiasm on the potential for a large-scale recycling facility somewhere down near Sussex that would be fed from St. John, Moncton, and Fredericton, because now you've got scale. It would create 200 to 300 full-time, well-paying jobs, have this positive impact on the environment, and it's got access to markets because of freight, train or rail or containers. Because of St. John or getting it to Halifax or taking it by train down to the States. Catches no political juice. There's no interest in it seems. But maybe that's some evidence to what you just said about how one thing will fill in the space of the other. Carl, you have some thoughts on?
Well, yeah, one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein is the one that goes something like, we can't expect to solve our problems using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them.
Yeah.
And that speaks to me, I mean, that resonates very much about the whole challenge of climate change. And again, about most of our problems. There's wisdom in what Einstein said. And a lot of our challenges, I think, with climate change have come as a result of a fatal flaw. There are two fatal flaws, I think, in our system of economics around which we have built our world. One, it's built on the notion of infinite growth, and we've all drank the Kool-Aid on that one, right? Because we have to have economic growth, because if we don't have it, we're in a recession, and that's bad for all of us. Except there's a great quote. That goes, anyone who believes that infinite growth can continue forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. And it's from an economist.
That's right.
So I have to say, I can say it with courtesy. It's a quote.
And
it's not me. But the point is, we probably have to rethink this whole notion of our consumption-based world and realign it perhaps towards a world that is based on sustainability, or maybe like where was the Kingdom of Bhutan? Base it on happiness or human factors.
Yeah, because other cultures. I'm thinking of First Nations culture. So if we can integrate more elements of First Nation culture into our decision-making processes, because they would never, in general terms, talk about growth. It would always be, you are nature. You are part of nature. You're not nature's over there for your exploitation or your resources. It's you're all one and the same. So there would be no language like growth. It would simply be redistribution.
Right.
It came from there and it goes there.
And can I speak to what I see as, and I'm not an economist, but I know a little bit about it, I guess. The second issue, major fatal flaw of our economic system is encompassed in one word: externality. And you can go and Google it to find a definition of externality, but it essentially means that in our economic system, if something is available and perceived to be in infinite quantity, we don't put a price on it. Gold, platinum, we put prices on those because they're very rare and precious. But something like air or water, infinite. So we don't typically have a price on them, and we've allowed ourselves to use and abuse them for free. And that may have worked well when there weren't very many of us and we weren't into the types of things that we are now. And it was just fur for flint trading, no problem. But now, where we have huge impacts embedded into the products and food and everything else that we buy and sell, huge environmental impacts embedded, they're free for the most part under our current pricing system. And that's a big problem. Because, for example, if we have two competing products on a store shelf, let's say dishwashing liquid, one is made here, made with a huge environmental impact, but it's really cheap. We've got another one that's got this green logo on it that says environmentally friendly, but that took a little extra effort. It's a little more expensive. What happens when we go to buy? We go and look. Most of us, even folks with a pretty big concern about the environment, will look at that price and say that we buy the cheap one. But it's because it's getting a free ride from the environment. Now, if we took all of those impacts and internalized them from externalities and internalized them into the products, guess what happens? All of a sudden, this dirty product gets more expensive. And next thing you know, it's more expensive than the green one, and we'll all buy the green one. And that's called market transformation. When we switch, and you know what happens to expensive products? They disappear. You know?
Yeah.
And now that's a big deal, and it's very tough to do. But I believe that our biggest tool in solving all of this is our economic system. And the fact that we all have moral compasses, but they waver a little sometimes. We have money compasses that are very, very true.
Yeah.
And if we start to put price signals towards sustainability versus increased consumption, we can turn this ship around.
Yep.
And the first price signal we need is a price on carbon. That's very challenging for us to understand, but you know, I pay for my electricity based on how much I use. I pay for my phone based on how much I use. I pay for groceries based on how much I use. So why shouldn't polluters pay based on what they pollute? And if we pollute a lot, isn't it morally right that we should probably be paying a bit more?
Yeah.
And if this steers us to do less, there we go.
So take us deeper into one of the quotes that I pulled up earlier about the Nobel Prize winning economist saying the carbon taxes are the solution to climate change, because that seems to be the next step. For most people, notion of a carbon tax, they might hear the word tax more than they hear the word carbon in that title, and they'll feel like something's being taken away from them. Because with the implementation of a new carbon tax like the current federal government is hovering around or inching towards, they might not understand, jokey public might not understand the full implication or consequences or range of that behavior shift. Because the intent is really a behavior shift, not an economic social policy shift. Can you take us deeper into that so that, 5 minutes from now, if people watch, they'll go, oh, that's what that's all about. Because Carl, you started to intimate into the pieces. Right. Peter, you want to...
I take the analogy back to smoking again. The price I don't know. I have no clue what the price of a carton of cigarettes is. I don't care. Yeah. I do know it's gone up substantially, and a lot of that has been taxation over the years.
Yeah.
The number of smokers in Canada, I assume other parts of, well, not all parts of the world, in Canada especially, it's gone down substantially. So that price has had a positive impact on reducing the amount of people, the number of people that smoke, for example. Has that had an economic impact? Yes. When I was a teenager, I lived in Simcoe, Ontario, near Delhi, Simcoe, Tillsonburg area, which was, the tobacco capital of Canada. When you were 12 years old, you go work in the tobacco fields, right? There ain't much of that there left anymore, right? But that's one thing, that's one behavior, one habit, that's smoking. But the complexity here is that there's so many different places on which carbon pricing touches. So all those different players, depending on the industry, whether it's manufacturing, fossil fuels, transportation, they're all going to get their back up and say, well, that's going to affect my business, especially when there's this little country south of us called the United States, who, from a policy perspective, aren't doing anything right now. So there's a perceived a challenge from a competitive perspective, right? Because there's another price challenge there. I like to think of this as an opportunity to be innovative in that regard. One of the things that, and I've spent 15 years of my career in manufacturing, and I've 10 of that, ironically, making car parts for a living. And one of the challenges, I'll give you a perfect analogy. So as an automotive parts supplier, you can get a contract with Ford or GM or Chrysler, and they will say in year one, we're going to sell you that, and you're going to sell us that widget for $1. In year two, you're going to sell for 98 cents. In year three, you're going to sell for 96. In year four, you're going to sell for 94 cents. And you're sitting there with a potential contract worth tens of millions of dollars. And you're going to say, okay, we'll take that contract. then it's up to you to figure out how to make that efficiently, right? Because you know that 4 years from now you're going to be selling that widget for 6 cents less on the dollar. You figure it out, right? And I think that we have I think we can be much more creative in the way in which we address competitiveness than other than, well, you know, manufacturing's going well because we've got 70 cents on the dollar against the United States. Well, you know, if we're really competitive, it shouldn't matter if it's 80 cents. I know some of my manufacturing friends take issue with that, but personally I don't, right? Or the same thing with labor. You know, labor, especially textiles, moves around the world. It's in Bangladesh now. It used to be in the States. It's in Bangladesh. It's going to be, you know, I'm sure we can check some of our clothing now and see it's made in some African countries, for example. So that global trade moves where the labor costs go down. But if we look at our value add and we look at our collective intelligence to be innovative with whatever it is that we do, I think that in itself, carbon pricing can be a tool to help push that innovation, which is needed anyway. The economy, the world, the widgets that we buy always change, right? Imagine you were in the horse and buggy trade 120 years ago and this thing called a car came along. You know, I'm going to run around and tell people, I'm not going to invest in General Motors. Look at all my horses, right? We're in the exact same situation today where we're looking at the car being replaced by a different mode of powering that car. It's no different than horses being replaced by the Model T or A, whatever it was, 110, 15 years ago. It's the exact same thing. It happens. It's evolution. We will have new modes of transportation. We will have different ways of living. We can't stay where we are. We never will. We can't. We can't stand still.
Yep. As long as we don't do more damage to the environment. Because that 100-year shift that happened from buggy to car is part of what did it, which gets into corporate control over things. But Carl, explore that same theme.
Well, I think, you know, I don't think we need to convince economists about the importance of a price on carbon in solving this. I mean, the Nobel Peace Prize, again, just awarded to an economist who spent, I think, 30 years working on this. And the conclusion is always, yes, a well-implemented price on carbon will change people's behaviors because it makes it real for them. And we all have that money compass. We all want to save money. So all of a sudden we will go to the behaviors that result in a lower carbon footprint. But I'll say, I think there are 3 really important elements to proper implementation of a price on carbon. 1, has to be done slowly, scaled in over a number of years. So all those folks who are in businesses that will be impacted, and there will be, because this is a major transition in our economy. All those people who are in those businesses can have some certainty about what's coming and when it's coming so they can make plans. Whether it's to find new innovations, to get new technology to improve efficiency, whatever it is. But then they can see it coming because they've got some guarantee. So number 1, implement it slow. 2, we're not here to sacrifice ourselves and our own economic well-being. So to your point about our neighbors to the south or anyone else who's not doing a similar policy, look, we already do tariffs at the border for certain products for certain reasons that come up, right? Well, why wouldn't we then have a carbon tariff that says, look, if you're not paying for the externality of that product over there, how about we collect it and we will use it here? Right? Because we want a level playing field. We don't want cheap stuff that got in through the back door, putting our people who are striving to do the right thing out of business. Number 3, and this may be the most important one of them, and that is, I believe a price on carbon needs to be revenue neutral.
100%.
And this is the area, I think, where many people out there are very apprehensive or skeptical, because government doesn't always have a stellar reputation when it comes to missing out on the opportunity of a lot of cash to do some special products. No, revenue neutral means that all of the money that is pulled in via a price on carbon needs to be set aside and given back, either in the form of direct tax breaks, or in the form of efficiency programs or other incentives. But some way needs to be given back. So it is a net zero for government, and people can see all of a sudden, wait a minute, I've just shifted my tax load, so it's now less, for example, on income tax, and maybe it's more on this price on carbon. But at the end of the year, it's just shifted. Now, a couple of thoughts on that too. If, for myself as a Canadian taxpayer, if I all of a sudden find I'm paying, currently let's say, I'm paying this amount of income tax and I'm not paying a price on carbon. But let's say a price on carbon comes and I find that I'm paying this on carbon, but now I'm paying this on income. The net result is still, the net amount is still the same. But all of a sudden I have control over this one. I can change my behaviors and I can actually make my costs go down. If I focus on ways I can use less carbon, essentially have a smaller carbon footprint, pay a smaller amount in terms of a carbon price, I can come out ahead potentially on this, right? Now that's a little idealistic, but just a couple of weeks ago there was a study that came out, and it was done by a gentleman who was a policy advisor to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Not a fan of carbon pricing. And this study came out and it concluded that a revenue neutral price on carbon, because it's collected not only on individual carbon footprints but also on industrial, would have a bit of a bigger pot of money, and when returned back would actually make the average middle income family come out ahead.
Redistribution again.
If we can see that reality, why would we resist something that's going to return more to us and create the positive changes that we need? You know, I think we just need to have a good, sincere conversation, and we need to have trust, and we need to have truth in all of this too.
And transparency in that.
Transparency, integrity, all of these things. You bet. You bet. Probably needs to be at arm's length the government, so that people can't, ambitious politicians can't say, I want that pot. No, revenue neutral.
Or we need a different type of politician who would maintain the integrity of the system, which is another thing. We've got about 5 minutes left, so you can be on time. Can you give us, following that same theme that you both offered, what specifically should New Brunswick's new government do, given that the window of time is now for creating policy incentives or economic incentives, behavior shifts for households? What is it that in the next 4 years, whatever this new government unfolds as, that New Brunswick should be doing in order to help lead the citizens of the province in a new direction, so that we're taking care of ourselves? So what do we need to do to take care of ourselves? Your top 3 things.
I think I agree with Carl. The carbon pricing has to be transparent and revenue neutral, regardless of who's running the province.
Yeah. So it shouldn't even be a political issue, should it?
Absolutely not. No. It should be whoever's in power. It's just a given. That's a foundation for whatever the initiative is shaped like. So carbon pricing definitely has to be in place. I think one of the things, so that's a financial mechanism or a tool. I think what we could spend more time looking at is the potential positive impact on the New Brunswick economy as a result of doing this as well. Not just from things like improving energy efficiency in homes. That in itself will spur economic activity. But probably more important than that is export potential. What can we export? We are a small province. We're 750,000 people. North America is close to 400 million people now alone. So what is it we can do here to export? Because realistically, we are a small market. I mean, we're doing some good work now with some companies that can export energy efficiency type products and services. But how can we expand beyond that? So I think that we need to look at the opportunity from our province beyond the borders of our province from an export potential, because there's a much larger market out there than just those 3 oceans and Maine, right? So that would be my summary again, regardless of who's running the province whenever we find that out.
Yeah.
And Carl?
Well, I do think a price on carbon is something that we need to look at seriously. That's a market-based solution. Market-based is typically the type of solution that parties to the right of the spectrum would embrace and love, right? So it seems to me, no matter how things shake down here in the province, putting a price on carbon should be one of the first steps. And then all of a sudden, here's I think a potential huge benefit to doing that. A number of years ago, I worked in the provincial metalworking industry when I was working with the province, and I would go around to visit different metalworking shops around the province, and I was amazed at the fact that in virtually every one of them, there was a genius out back in the shop who could make anything.
I would echo
And I
that.
started calling them backyard geniuses, and it made me wonder, how come we have so many smart people in this province that we don't have more patents and intellectual property and that type of thing? That's another issue, of course. But when all of a sudden we put a price on carbon and we make conservation and living sustainable real for everyone, I have a feeling we will leverage the geniuses all around this province to start finding solutions. All of a sudden, neighborhood carpools. You know, if you get 4 people in a vehicle, you've just saved 3/4 of the gas of commuting into town to work. And it doesn't have to be formal. Or maybe something formal will come up, like a ride-sharing app or something like that, that generates revenue for whoever writes it. I'd love to see us displace all of this imported fossil fuel, because we send hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars out of the province every year for imported fossil fuel. And I'd love to see us, I always say, you have to sell a lot of French fries and lobsters and 2x4s to get all that money back. Well, wouldn't it be great if we could just keep it here and start relying on our homegrown energy sources like community-owned wind farms or solar farms? What about using our forest energy, a renewable form of energy that we have right here? I'd argue our biggest asset here, and the natural asset in the province, is our forest. Why don't we use that energy and keep our money here, putting New Brunswickers to work and building our own prosperity? I think it starts with a price on carbon, and I think there is so much potential to do the right thing and find ourselves way better off as a result of it.
Thanks so much, guys.
Agreed.
Appreciate it. Thank you for watching. As always, be good, have fun, love each other.
The Dennis Report is an independent media production. To support the program, go to DennisAtchison.com and click Become My Patron on Patreon.